I will attempt to place field experiments and lab experiments within cross-sectional, reduced form, and structural approaches to start. Then I will talk about the types of field experiments that have arisen in economics. And I will talk about how these field experiments have been used to think about testing theory for speaking to policymakers, etc. And from there, I don't want you to leave here without having a few thoughts about design. So if you would go out tomorrow and run an experiment, I want you to have a few things in the back of your mind about how you would design your experiment. Okay, so I'll probably end this morning with a few design insights. And this afternoon, I will bring forward something I call opening my laptop, which will include several examples of the different types of field experiments that I'll talk about this morning. Okay, I'll break down the types of field experiments into something called an artifactual field experiment, a framed field experiment, and a natural field experiment. And along the way here, please ask any questions if you have them. I don't want this to turn into a University of Chicago seminar. I'll only get through 3 or 4 slides if we do that. But by all means, please ask a clarifying question, or if I say something that you don't agree with, just call me on it and we can discuss it. Okay? So let's get started. So in light of the fact that the last few methods lectures have been about things like reduced form models and structural models, I've been thinking about how to place generation of data into some sort of schematic. And the way I think about it is, on the one end, we have ways of modeling interesting data or ways to look at naturally occurring data. And of course, we have a lot of different methods over here, which we've been playing around with for years. And when you step back, the simple goal here is to create the proper counterfactual. Now, all of these approaches have different ways to create the proper counterfactual, and we debate whether the assumptions that we make using these approaches are valid or not. But essentially, the crux of it is we cannot observe the proper counterfactual, so we have to develop a technique to construct that proper counterfactual to estimate a treatment effect. Okay, now on the other end of the extreme, we have something that has arisen in the last several decades called laboratory experimentation. Okay, now here, obviously the most important assumption for most lab experiments is that you have proper randomization. This is your identification assumption whenever you're dealing with these types of experiments, or most of the experiments, is that they're using randomization as their instrumental variable. Okay, once you have proper randomization and a proper sample size, this is, of course, what gives you the proper counterfactual. Now, lab experiments have been around for a long time. The way I look at it, I've traced experiments in economics all the way back to Daniel Bernoulli, who ran essentially the most famous St. Petersburg paradox experiments back in 1738. And interestingly, his resolution to the St. Petersburg paradox was something that looked a lot like expected utility theory. Okay, from there you can trace economic experiments to Thurston, which was published in the Journal of Social Psychology. And here he's essentially trying to construct indifference curves in this 1931 paper. Now, within the economics literature, the first real market experiment that was published was actually published in the JPE in 1948. And it was written by Chamberlain, not by Vernon Smith. Vernon Smith gets a lot of credit for being the first to run market experiments, but Vernon Smith was actually a student of Chamberlain's, and he was a subject in these experiments. That's, of course, what motivated Vernon to think harder about running market experiments. It was Chamberlain's market experiments, which he ran in the mid-40s, which were eventually published in the JPE. Now, Nash, of course, ran a lot of 2x2 simple experiments as well, testing his theories of games. Okay? Now, it's clear, however, that the experimental method did not really pick up very quickly within the economics literature. And what I have here, I have number of publications on the y-axis, and I have time here. You have Chamberlain back in here. Vernon Smith published 2 seminal papers in the JPE in 1962 and 1965. Charlie Plott came in around here, but there still was not a lot of action within the economics literature. Until around the 70s and 80s, when all of a sudden we have this explosion of research using the laboratory experimental method. Now, I've updated this and partly refined it in this particular time series. And what this shows is the number of experimental publications in top 15 journals from 1948 to 2006. And as you can see, where 98 left off, we have a huge increase in the number of publications within economics. There's only one major journal that has not followed this path. Derek, can you name that journal? The very journal that was publishing Chamberlain's work and Smith's work. The JPE is the only journal that has not followed this particular path in publishing lab experiments. But the JPE has been extremely sympathetic to field experiments. Okay? So, all seems well, and maybe we should just stop with lab experiments.
Your data is wrong.
Is that right?
I didn't publish any lab experiments in Jolly when I was there unless somebody forced me to.
Tell us how you really feel.
I'm just saying it's not the only.
Major. Top 4. I apologize for that, Jolly. Now, what hit home for me when I was working at the Council of Economic Advisors was, I do a lot of laboratory experiments myself. And I was arguing that when we revise the benefit cost guidelines, we should be taking account of the results from Kahneman, Tversky, and Thaler on the endowment effect. We should be thinking hard about why willingness to accept is 5 to 10 times larger than willingness to pay, and think about using that fact within the benefit cost guidelines. Okay, and this is a verbatim quote from, I can't tell you his name, but it's fair to say he was a top-ranking White House official. Even though these results appear prevalent, they are suspiciously drawn by methods similar to scientific numerology because of students who are not real people. Okay, now whenever I present lab work, this is the first line of defense that you give me. Look, John, these are students. They're just playing around. They're not real people. It's exactly what the White House thought back in 2002 as well. Now, there are more criticisms than just the representativeness of the population. So there was a discussion, a brief discussion in 1980, which was begun by Cross, who notes it seems to be extraordinarily optimistic to assume that behavior in an artificially constructed market game would provide direct insights into actual market behavior. He's taken a shot at what Vernon's working on throughout the 60s and 70s. And a broad statement like that makes you step back and say, well, what exactly are the differences between that environment, that particular domain, and the domain of interest to theoreticians and empiricists? Of course, a commodity, the stakes, the environment, et cetera, might be different. Now, Vernon responds to this in his AER paper saying sometimes experiments are criticized. People suggest that there are differences between lab and field behavior, but so far to date, there's no data to show that. So therefore, the criticism is pure speculation. This is about where we are still in the economics literature. We're gathering data in part via field experiments to help to inform this particular debate about the generalizability between lab behavior and other markets. Okay? So I argue that one important component of field experiments will, by necessity, be this idea to answer the first order question, does behavior in the lab generalize to behavior in the field? Okay, so now we go to field experiments, and let's step back and think about some of the early field experiments. And I've just written a paper about what I call the 3 major waves of field experimentation. And I'm defining field very broadly, as you'll see in this first particular wave, which I'm calling the dawn of field experiments. This is a paper with Steve Levitt that was just published in the European Economic Review. we call the dawn of field experiments literally the manure experiments that Nyman and Fisher were running in the teens and the 20s. Okay, they were literally in the field randomizing different manure types over plots of land. But interestingly enough, this has had profound implications for not only lab and field experiments in economics, but experimental methods throughout the sciences. Why? Because through this, Fisher developed what's called the tripod of experimentation, where he put forth randomization, block design, and replication as three of the important factors that lead to appropriate conditions for good statistical analysis. Okay, this was essentially laid out in the 20s by Fisher and Nyman. Now, what we call the second wave of field experiments would be the wave of social experiments. Who do you think should get credit for being an early pioneer of social experiments? In economics, not in life more generally. Any guesses? It's a person who received her PhD from MIT. And she's currently working at Resources for the Future. Heather Ross. So Heather Ross was instrumental in running the early social experiments that were testing Friedman's proposed negative income tax. At the time, these experiments cost roughly $5 million. I think it's fair to say that this could have been one of the most expensive doctoral dissertations in economics still today. Right around the same time in Europe, there were some electricity pricing schemes in Great Britain that were being executed that would fall under the guise of a social experiment. Now, social experiments have not only led to some very interesting policy results, which I think of the development experiments that Michael will be talking about later is a kind of social experiment, and I'll be calling all of these framed field experiments in a minute. But of course, they presented some really new and interesting questions as well. For example, plots of land cannot excuse themselves from treatment, and they cannot select into treatment. So this gets at the selection issue that Heckman has taken on. Now, and others, of course, have taken on. Now, more broadly, this issue touches off this debate, which some people tell me there's a debate between structural econometricians and experimental advocates. Being at the University of Chicago, I don't see that debate because we all agree, but some people say that there's a debate between these types of researchers. Now, the third wave, which I'm arguing that we're in right now, are the more recent field experiments, and this is what Harrison and I, when we came up with this classification of types of field experiments. So we can think about the lab as being a very sterile, controlled environment where sometimes we use randomization to achieve identification. Some lab experiments don't. Recall that most of Vernon Smith's experiments do not use randomization to achieve identification. They're called experiments because he has control. Okay? So what we call an artifactual field experiment is something that I don't really consider a field experiment at all. But nonetheless, it's an important step from the laboratory environment in that a lot of people believe that representativeness of the population is an important variable when thinking about generalizing behavior. So we call an artifactual field experiment one where it's identical to a lab experiment, but it's using a non-standard subject pool. Okay, so if that's the only problem with the lab method, then the lab method is not in any trouble at all, frankly. Because it's not very hard to go out and recruit farmers, to go out and recruit CEOs, to go out and recruit Chicago board options traders and stock traders. I've done all of those things myself. It's not that hard to recruit those types and bring them into the lab. Okay? Now, the next step in this new wave of field experiments, we categorized as, go ahead. I'll talk about that a little bit later. Essentially, it's blocking on a characteristic and then randomizing over that characteristic. So you'd put you'd block on, you'd say women, and then I'd say I want half women in treatment and half in control. That's what a block design is. You can compare that to a factorial design where you're just randomizing each person coming in. A factorial design, then you might not get the variation in women or in men or in any other characteristic that you're interested in. But we'll talk a little bit about that later. That's a good question, though. Okay, we denoted a framed field experiment as one whereby you begin to add naturalness in the environment, such as the stakes are the same as the environment that you're thinking about, the information is the same, the task is the same, the commodity is the same, the timeline is the same. However, people still know that they're taking part in an experiment, importantly. They're still signing consent forms. They're still selecting into an environment in which they know that their behavior will be scrutinized. Okay? Now, what I think of as the final frontier in this experimental wave is what we denote as a natural field experiment. And this is going to an environment, randomizing within that environment without anyone knowing that there's an experiment going on. So they're acting in their environment as naturally as possible, of course, by definition. But yet the experimenter is going into that environment, overlaying perhaps a randomization, and that's how the experimenter is achieving identification, by looking at treatment and control, for example. So now you have randomization, which is the beauty behind experimentation, and you have realism. By definition, you're doing the randomization in an environment where no one even knows that they're taking part in an experiment. I consider this the best of both worlds. Now, it's not always possible to run a natural field experiment on a lot of the interesting and important economic questions that we can think about. So where I depart from my experimental colleagues is I don't think lab and field experiments can answer every question that we face as a society. But it can answer a lot of interesting questions. Okay? Any questions about this classification scheme? Yes? Sure. And if I don't, please bring that up. By and large, even though I have IRB approval for all of my natural field experiments, I'm beginning to learn that a lot of it is IRB exempt. But we can discuss that later. And I've written a little bit on consent in social experiments. A few recent science papers where there's a give and take. Because that's when I wrote this paper for Science, a letter was written back into Science saying, List gleefully says natural field experiments are great, and the fellow says, what happened to informed consent? So then I had to write a long response back. But we can talk about that later. Any other questions on this? Okay, good. Good. So in development, the way I think about it is there are a lot of development field experiments that fall here. I'm not sure if Michael's going to talk about those, but I can talk about those this afternoon. A lot fall here, and a few fall here. Okay? Okay, so the underlying idea now is pretty simple. We have some ways to generate our own data. We have lab experiments. We have several different types of field experiments, and we have models that can look at naturally occurring data. Now, the argument here is that it's worthwhile to think about sampling these environments over here, even though they're small-scale field settings. Many times we can ask and answer questions over here that are impossible to answer over here, and I'll give you a few examples in a few moments. Of course, these aren't the most important markets, so then we have to think hard about how we can generalize results from over here. Okay? And that's exactly what theory and further empirical testing can do for you. Okay? So what are some uses of field experiments? Now, for me, most of the time, I'm going out trying to test theory, either one of my own theories or a theory that's out there. Okay, but there are many other uses, of course. Measuring key parameters. If you reject a theory, collecting enough information to construct a new theory, for example. Speaking to policymakers, which Michael will talk a lot about. And most recently, I've found that field experiments can actually make firms a lot of money. So in talking about natural field experiments, I'll talk about some of my experiments with charities and with firms near the end of this afternoon. Okay? Now, it's been raised a few times, and naturally it will be raised, and that's these methodological questions. And what I've argued is the most important question facing lab experimenters, and that's whether behavior in the lab generalizes to behavior in the field. I'm not going to talk much about these methodological considerations. Number two, I think, is a very important question facing behavioral economists. Many behavioral theories today are written based on results from the lab. To date, we have little idea what overlaying a real market setting does to those anomalies, and we have little idea about how market experience, whether it attenuates or diminishes or exacerbates these anomalies. There's not a lot of empirical evidence on that. Okay, and then in general, are we making proper inference from lab and naturally occurring data? And that's exactly what Levitt and I talked about in our recent Journal of Economic Perspectives paper. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about inference. And a useful place to start is probably right at the center of the wave of behavioral economics, and that's the endowment effect. Can someone tell me about these famous endowment effect experiments? Mugs and candy bars? Devin? If you're going to be here, I'm going to call you.
People are brought in the lab and randomly given a mug or candy bar, and then they're often asked if they're willing to switch to the other one.
Okay.
They find that once you've given one randomly, your willingness to pay for a different one is less than your willingness to keep one you have.
Okay, so in a series of experiments, Kahneman, Knesh, and Thaler ran both willingness to accept and willingness to pay treatments, but they also ran trading experiments. In the trading experiments at Cornell, they would bring in students to sit in a classroom. They would give half of them a mug. They would give half of them a candy bar. And they told the students, if you were given a mug, would you like to trade with the experimenter your mug for a candy bar? If you were given a candy bar, you can trade with the experimenter your candy bar for a mug. What they found is that 90% of people who were given a mug kept the mug. 90% of people who were given a candy bar kept the candy bar. Okay, so they argued in a JPE paper in 1990 that this was strong evidence of an endowment effect, or once you have the good in hand, you place an attachment value on it. Okay? Because neoclassical theory would say if P% trade the mug for the candy bar, then 1 minus P% should trade the candy bar for the mug. Right? That's what neoclassical theory has a strong prediction there. So let's take that to heart and go out to a naturally occurring environment where people engage in trade. And that's exactly what this set of studies did, is that it went to several small-scale markets, sports card markets, pin trading markets, etc., open-air markets, etc., and it essentially replicated the mugs and candy bar experiments. Now, it replicated it in the sense that I have proportioned that trade here. Of course, neoclassical theory, if they're equal goods, it should be 50%. And I'm binning people here, really inexperienced people, really experienced people. So it replicated it in the sense that this little bar right here, about 1 out of 10 people trade. So the really inexperienced people in these marketplaces look a lot like Cornell coffee mug and candy bar traders. But as you randomly give them experience, or as they gain experience endogenously, the data has both, behavior approaches exactly what neoclassical theory would predict. Okay, roughly, not quite half, but nearly half of people trade their randomly allocated good. Now, what does this mean? Some people have interpreted this as saying, well, that shows that the lab experiments are somehow wrong. I think that's an incorrect, that's too strong of an interpretation. I think the way to view this is that you have results from the lab, equally as valid results from the field. And together, these two pieces of information can lead to a much deeper understanding of human behavior. And of course, that's what theorists have now taken on the challenge. These various theorists, Poroshenko, Kazeghian, Rabin, Chambers, etc., have taken on this challenge to try to model exactly what's going on in both the lab and the field data. Now, empirically, of course, it's important to first replicate my data, which thankfully these data have now been replicated several times, and to go back to the lab and think about what are the factors that attenuate or exacerbate these types of effects that I'm finding, and then go back to the field for more testing in naturally occurring environments. That's exactly the way that I envision science evolving to maximize exactly what we learn using theory, lab experiments, and data from the naturally occurring world. Okay? So that's something on inference. Now, another idea we can think about is causes. So one particularly vexing problem in some walks of research is that we observe a pattern in the data, but we're not exactly sure what are the underlying causes for that pattern. And I think the discrimination literature is a good example of this. So when we observe discrimination in the real world, what are our major models for why that discrimination is occurring? I think of it as two major models. One was developed by a guy at the University of Chicago in his dissertation, and it was published in 1957. All right, Becker's taste for discrimination. People might be discriminated against because there are bigots out there who derive utility from discriminating against them. And the other major model would be what Pigou called third-degree price discrimination or statistical discrimination. Right? An entrepreneur, in her efforts to maximize her profits, discriminates against agents. Right? Under Becker's model, the entrepreneur can forego profits to cater her bigotry. Under third-degree price discrimination, in an effort to maximize her profits, she's discriminating. It's very hard to parse, as you've tried. It's very hard to parse these two types of discrimination in naturally occurring data. I'm going to argue that with a series of field experiments, in the spirit of this paper in the QG, one can make some headway to determine what is the major model at work. It might be a little bit of each, of course. Okay, so let's talk about that, discrimination experiment. And this should be familiar to all of those who are familiar with the literature. These are paired audit study field experiments. Okay, so what I have here to begin, I have 12 disabled agents, and these are agents in wheelchairs paired with 12 non-disabled testers who are not in wheelchairs but who are driving the identical vehicles to various repair shops in and around Chicago. Okay? Now, there are dozens of design decisions that you need to make when running these paired tester experiments. Whether they should have a script, whether they should both wear red baseball caps, whether they should both have hair to the shoulder, etc. What I'm going to argue is unless those variables importantly interact with my two treatments here, all they're affecting is the level. They're not affecting the interpretation that I'm making on what's driving the discrimination. But you can call me on that, and please do, if you don't agree with it. Okay, so they're driving identical cars to repair shops, and they're telling the mechanic, today I would like to get my front bumper fixed. So this will not be an experiment based on the mechanic telling them there are 5 things wrong rather than 2 things wrong. That's interesting too. But nonetheless, here we're pinpointing the front bumper needs to be fixed. Okay? Are there any questions about the general design? I know I've been very vague. Yes? This is kind of tricky because my testers know that it's an experiment and the mechanics don't. So Loosely, I've called this somewhere in the area of a framed field experiment, just because my testers do know, but they are acting in a natural environment. It wouldn't be artifactual and natural. It would be framed or natural, right? So I'll just take the bad one, or quote bad one, if you want to call it that. Okay? Any other questions on this? Okay, what do you think happens? Joe, what do you think?
I think the disabled
Do better. Yeah, you could see a model like that, actually. The disabled actually receive, they do better. They receive much higher offers. But I could certainly see that the sympathy argument. But in our data, the disabled receive roughly 30% higher offers in the repair market. Okay? But again, you're left in the world of what does this mean? Right? So we can let's begin to chisel away at this. Because my intuition is with yours. I could have easily seen it go the other way. So let's think about running a survey, which we did. Yes, go ahead, Luigi.
John, what do you think there is a matter of fact that if I'm disabled and I want to sort of show that I'm discriminated, I will act less aggressively, so naturally I will get sort of an offer that's high in price.
Yeah, let's hold that and see if we can take it out with the next treatment. But I certainly agree that whenever running these audit studies, given that the audit pair knows, they might give the experimenter exactly what they think the experimenter wants to see, or what they want to signal to the experimenter. I'm perfectly sympathetic to that, and I think it does happen in a lot of cases. Let's see if we can take that on. Maybe it does interact with treatment. Yes. Yeah, what we end up doing is we choose the lowest offering body shop, and we give them $350 then to go and get their car fixed with that body shop. That's to avoid deception. Otherwise, it's just deceiving people. So that was the incentive. Yes?
You assume that disabled and non-disabled are the same but for being disabled because the mechanic might perceive them to be richer or that
Exactly. So the mechanic might perceive these two types to have different willingness to pay distributions. So I'm with you there, but I immediately went to the willingness to pay distributions were different based on search costs. So then that's where the surveys went. We surveyed disabled, and what you find is that they do search less. You survey mechanics, and they also believe that the disabled search less. So that's some evidence that this is statistical discrimination based on differences in willingness to pay distributions. Yes? Exactly. That it goes the other way. I think here, I'm just trying to show you that if you pair two field experiments, you can disentangle these. I have not written down a taste-based model, but you can see how it could work, but my initial intuition's in the other direction as well. Yes. Yes, they were actually in wheelchairs.
Okay, and would it be a substantially different experiment if your testers were claiming disability by being in wheelchairs?
It certainly might be, and I don't have data on that. I do have data on sexual orientation where people are feigning that. And there is a difference in data there. Okay, but now just looking at the survey evidence, of course, that's not strong. So what we need to do is think about new treatments that can potentially provide more insights into what's going on. Okay, so first of all, what we want to do is get a new tester type set, send those people out, and see if we can replicate our results, because it was a small sample. And then we want to send out the pairs running another treatment where both agent types simply say, I'm getting a few price quotes. That's the only thing that's changed, is both disabled and non-disabled make the statement, I'm getting a few price quotes. Okay? So in the replication treatment, we get exactly the same result, albeit it's smaller. Now it's only 20%. difference between the disabled and non-disabled. What do you think happens on the next click? Okay, by that one statement, what happens is the disabled and non-disabled, now you do see the disabled having a slightly smaller, but of course these two aren't different, but nonetheless it's slightly smaller. Now you can see that there's no difference between the price quotes across disabled and non-disabled. So I think that gives you some evidence that what was going on is it was statistical discrimination based on heterogeneous search cost or heterogeneous search behavior. Again, we don't have it sealed tight, and you never can with just 2 treatments, and not a good theory. These are still pilot experiments. But nonetheless, you can see the power of pairing 2 field treatments together and one being driven based on a theory that would subscribe, here's how behavior should actually change going from treatment 1 to treatment 2. Okay, so you can think of a lot better examples on black-white, in cars, and across different cities that we're going there, but we have not gotten there yet. Okay, I hope what this illustrates is the power of pairing different field experimental treatments and the power of parsing the different theories that might be describing the behavior, or the motivations that might be underlying the behaviors. Yes?
So when you did this, you did these in sequence. So you started with, or did you have this set already doing the design?
It was set in the design. I told the story. Okay. Any other questions on this? Okay, let's move on. There's a lot to cover. Okay, let's get back to the basics. I want to give you something that you can go home with, and this is my idea that if you're going out to run an experiment tomorrow, what mistakes would I want you to avoid if you're designing your experiment? Okay, and these are common mistakes that I observe every day when I review papers or read colleagues' papers. I'm going to break this down into four different types. And Michael will be talking about intracluster correlation coefficients a little bit, so if I don't get to that, that will be in my slides, and you can have my slides, of course. Okay, I'm going to start by saying this idea of a 0-1 treatment. You either get the pill or you don't, and we have equal outcome variances. This would be the standard neoclassical t-test type of idea. Letter B will be, again, 0-1 treatment, but now we have unequal outcome variances. The variance of the treatment might be double the variance of the control. If I suspect that, what should I do in my design? That's what this will answer. Letter C, treatment intensity. We're no longer in the realm of pill or no pill. We're in the realm of, should we have the incentive set at 1, 3, 5, 7, or 9? And exactly how should we design our experiment if we're allowed to pick over this range? Well, it's an interesting set of rules of thumb in that case. And then intracluster correlation coefficients are just a way to tax yourself. So the idea is, if randomization occurs at the village level, but the outcomes are at the individual level, and if there's correlation across individuals, we need to essentially tax ourselves and get a larger sample because of the correlation of behaviors within each village. And I'll have an example here that will show you the very large tax that you might have to impose on yourself. The idea is, why not impose it on yourself before you run the experiment rather than afterwards when you have to address the issue of independence of observations. So it's just trying to get your sample to be optimal at the very beginning. Okay, so I don't want to get caught up in this, but let's start with letter A and make some standard assumptions here. Assume that the outcome of the control is distributed normally with mean mu naught sigma squared variance, x1 the same for the control group. I'm going to define a minimum detectable effect of delta, and that's going to be important. Okay, we have our null and alternative. Now we're going to define 2 things. A significance level, of course, probability of type 1 error, alpha, and this is a standard equation that we're all familiar with. Equation 2 is a power equation. This is something that will likely be new for most of you if you have not designed experiments. This is, of course, just 1 minus the probability of type 2 error. And that equals this. These look very familiar, and you should know why. Okay? But I want to talk a little bit about power before solving these two equations. So let's think about the standard case. The standard case is we have the null distribution here, we have the alternative distribution here, and alpha, as we know, that's our typical definition of alpha. Now beta, of course, is the area of the alternative that will overlap with the area of the null, when basically we're not rejecting the null when really we should be. Type 2 error. So in essence, what you have to set is you have to set alpha and beta, and you have to have a minimum detectable effect before you go out and run your experiments. Okay, now power here, of course, is the area to the right of beta under the alternative distribution. That's what we call power of the test. Okay, now power is interesting because I think most of our intuition stems from this typical regression model, where we think about it under a true null, what is the probability of observing the coefficient that we observed? That's usually where all of our intuition comes from. But now power is a little bit different. It's exploring if the alternative hypothesis is true, then what is the probability that the estimated coefficient lies outside the 95% confidence interval defined under this, you should say null, defined under the null. That's exactly what we're talking about with power. Okay? Now, if you solve those two equations, and let's assume variances are equal, like I mentioned, you get this simple equation, and this tells you exactly what your sample sizes should be. All right, we have the typical critical values here. This is a minimum detectable effect delta, and that's the standard deviation. Now it gives us some insights about how the necessary sample size changes with these variables. For example, it increases rapidly with the desired significance level and power. That's intuitive, and I'll show you some rules of thumb on that in a minute. It increases proportionally with the variance of the outcomes. Higher variance, optimal sample size, necessary sample size increases proportionally. Decreases inversely proportionally with the square of the minimum detectable effect size. Okay, now you can see that the sample size depends on the ratio. So many times when I'm talking about sample size, people always ask, I'm running an experiment, how many observations should I get? This tells you that. If you want to detect a 1 standard deviation change, this will tell you. If you want to detect a half a standard deviation change, this will tell you. A tenth of a standard deviation change, I'll give all this stuff on the next few slides. Okay? So let's start with that. Now, I'm not going to take a stand on why convention is this way, but the convention in the literature is to set alpha equal to 0.05 and power equal to 0.8. And we all know what that means. And we all know that there will be trade-offs. Okay? So as I mentioned, if you want to detect a 1 standard deviation change, now we have the answer. You need 15.68 observations in treatment, 15.68 observations in control. That will give you an 80% power and a significance level of 0.05. So if you just want to detect very large changes, you don't need large sample sizes. Okay, likewise, half a standard deviation. Well, now I know, you're getting the idea now that it's 15.68 times the standardized effect, right? So 15.68 in this case times 4, because it's 2 over 1 squared, and now I know if I want to detect a half of a standard deviation change, I need 64 observations per cell. There seems to be a magic number in our literature where people go out and get 30. Uh, I'm not quite certain where magic 30 comes from, but 8 out of 10 experiments that you read about in using mostly lab data is the magic number is 30. Well, not perfectly generalized over to what we're talking about, right? Now we've learned what Derek thinks about macro, and we've learned what he thinks about lab experiments. Okay, what is a magic 30? Well, it's 0.7 standard deviation change. That's what you can detect with 80% power. That's what magic 30 is. Nothing magical about that. Okay? And it comes simply from that equation. Now, here are some rules of thumb that give you an idea of how the necessary sample sizes change when you change type 1 and type 2 error. What I'm doing here is I'm simply changing the power from 80% to 95%, and I'm leaving the significance level the same. Necessary sample size goes up by 65%. Leave the power the same, go to significance level 0.01, now necessary sample size goes up by 49% from the baseline. Do them both, 2.27 times n, 127% increase in necessary sample size. Yes?
You said you didn't want to speak too much about the convention of this 20% beta, but could you give us a little bit of some kind of transition or
Yeah, I mean, it's clear what you're doing. If the alternative is true, you're not rejecting it 20% of the time. And if you want to have more power, if you want to not reject it 10% of the time, then you need a power of 0.9. Now, why this is developed, I can't determine why it's developed to be 0.8.
In your own practice, do you use 0.8?
Yes. Let me say a caveated yes. Unless costs are not prohibitive. What I haven't mentioned here is the cost of obtaining each observation. I'm assuming the cost and treatment and control are identical and let's say reasonable enough to where we want to get a sample size that's necessary, but we have to consider costs. So I will bring in costs too, but my first intuition is to go to 0.8. Yes? See, what I do a lot on that is I will block on those observables, and then that's a way to reduce residual variance, which is similar to afterwards than running it through regression. I'm blocking on those up front.
And how do you deal with the uncertainty of the variances? I mean, especially in an environment where you don't want to run a lot of trials because you don't want to contaminate the environment.
Yeah. So let's talk. That's a good segue to having unequal variances, and then I'll give an idea about how I get some intuition about the variances, which my answer is basically to run pilot experiments. But there's a cost, right? Each pilot I run, that's fewer data points for the real experiment. But remember, I'm always still about how many standard deviation changes do I want to detect. So in that world, it's if I want to detect a tenth of a standard deviation change, I know I need 1,568 observations, regardless of how big the variance is. Now that might beg the question of, well, look, if the variance is really small and you detect 1/10 of it, it's not very interesting. So that's right. But so what I typically look at older literature or run my own pilots. And that's how I get an idea of what the variances are going to look like. Yes? That depends on the situation and in the previous literature, what they have found. So if I'm in the area of education, I think 1/10 of a standard deviation is a pretty reasonable change to try to detect. If I'm doing gift exchange in the field, it might be like a 1/2 of a standard deviation because that's where the literature seems to be. So a lot of it's driven on the previous literature. That's sort of something you know it when you see it, but it's hard to generalize across situations because many of the situations are very different. when you're doing pricing experiments, it's the same sort of thing. We have a feel for what an elasticity should look like and what a big effect would be. Yeah. Okay, now when you talk about unequal variances, a very simple rule falls out of this. And the very simple rule is that the ratio of the optimal proportions of the total sample in control and treatment is equal to the ratio of the standard deviations. So if the treatment has double the standard deviation, then of course we need to adjust the samples, the optimal proportions equivalently. Now, with equal variances, that's why everything was equal in treatment and control, and here we just adjust them based on the variances. That's a very simple rule of thumb. In many studies, you see that the treatment and control will always have the same number of observations. That might be that we just don't know that, we didn't know that the variances were unequal. A lot of times theory will give us some indication that the variances will be different. And what I'm arguing here is just take account of that, because you'll increase your power if you shift the sample accordingly. Okay? So what about treatment levels? Now here what I'm thinking about is, let's say we're interested in the number of ads, various price levels, various incentive levels. And let's stick with homogeneous treatment effects so that the outcome variance is equal. And let's think about, in this particular example, how we want to allocate our sample. So let's say that the firm tells you you can allocate the sample across incentive levels 1, 3, 5, 7, and 9. And let's say that the firm tells you that you can have 1,000 subjects. How do you want to allocate those subjects across the 5 cells? Go ahead. Okay, so are you thinking let's say 20%, let's say 40% here, 40% here, and the rest in the middle? Let's say that I assume it's linear. The relationship is linear. The outcomes relationship is linear over the incentive space.
That's what the corner is there.
99% of people will say what? Equal. 99% of papers will say equal. None of you wanted to say it, right? Why didn't you want to say it? Because I wouldn't be asking the question. That'd be too obvious, right? But all of your intuitions are correct. And let's back up and consider exactly what we're doing here. We can rest on the regression model, and we can think about one of our goals here is to derive a very precise estimate of beta. So let's consider then, what is the formula for the standard error of beta? What's important here is that I can gain precision with increasing the variance in my treatment variable in the same manner that I can increase precision by increasing n. Doubling n is the same thing as doubling the variance in x. That's what the standard error formula tells us. So if I'm making a stand, I have a strong prior that this relationship is linear. What should I do with my 1,000? This is hardly ever done. Even if people make a strong stand on being linear, and even if they estimate a linear model, they will still have representation in the different cells. And most of the time, it will be a fifth, a fifth, a fifth, a fifth, a fifth. But certainly, you should put half on one end and half on the other end. Yes, Drew?
Here, do you want to have some people get nothing to get?
I was just saying that you just get 1 to 9, and that's my group. But yeah, you have this baseline, which is everyone else in the world, but they haven't selected in, so I still have a selection problem on those folks. But you could still say, well, wait a second, I want to at least test whether it's nonlinear. If not for the economics of the problem, just to keep the referees off my back. What should you do then? Now it gets a little dicier. Use your same intuition, but then add that you want to test linearity versus quadratic. Put everyone at 5? Put some at 5. What do you want? I'm just saying quadratic, and we'll go to cubic and quartic. But this will give you the general idea. And we're thinking it's in the middle of the incentive zone. Okay. There's a rule, quarter, half, quarter. Okay. Intuitively, this gives us a test for the quadratic. You're comparing the mean with the mean outcomes at the extreme, and it gives us our variance as well. Yes, Justin? Sure. Yeah, I have variance. And then, right? Okay. Do I have a typo? So then I understated my case, right? The case is even stronger. But I have this right, though. It's the standard error.
It's the variance of the.
Right. But thanks. Now on cubic, how many cells do you think you should have for cubic? If linear 2, quadratic 3, cubic 4. That's just a general rule. And you can find this in any design booklet as well. But the general idea is you're at the same time you're testing the turns. You're also taking into account variance. Okay? So this is just a quick rule of thumb on intensities that you can keep in the back of your mind. So let's end here. I'm going to have a little bit of time about intra-cluster correlations. And here, what I want to mention is that this arises, I would guess, in a lot of developing work, and it arises in a lot of work in firms and also in the lab when you have sessions. So the idea is when the level of randomization is different than the level that you're observing the outcomes at, you have to account for that difference via something called an intra-cluster correlation coefficient. And you should account for this, of course, before you go out and run the experiment. Now, let's go through an explicit example that hits home for me. We convinced United Airlines to run some incentive experiments. And in those incentive experiments, they insisted that randomization occur at the city level. Okay, they allowed us 4 cities to run the experiment in, with each city receiving, let's just say for sake, either high or low incentive. We're going to disregard the 0 case here. Thus, we're interested in the outcome, how many tickets are purchased by our various individuals in our experiment, and we're interested in how these high and low incentives affect those tickets purchased. And just for simplicity's sake, let's say each city we run the incentive experiment on an equal number of consumers, but the response of consumers might be correlated within the city. This is the intercluster correlation coefficient idea. Okay, so what I'm going to introduce here is the real sample size. So when you have intercluster correlation coefficients that matter or that are non-zero, you have to, in effect, penalize yourself by what I'm calling CE, or the cluster effect. Okay, so MK, that's our typical number of observations that we think about in experiments. M is number of subjects in a cluster, K is number of clusters. This correction effect will be 1 plus rho multiplied by M minus 1, where rho is your intercluster correlation coefficient. Okay, and that's the variance between clusters divided by the sum of the variance between and within clusters. That's a definition of an intercluster correlation coefficient. So essentially, I need to think about how many clusters do I have, how many people do I have in each cluster, and what is the intercluster correlation coefficient equal to? And that will dictate how many observations I need in this particular setting. Okay, so let's just think intuitively. What does rho going to 0 mean? Well, that means there's no correlation. So we don't need to adjust optimal sample sizes. We're back to our model that I presented earlier, essentially 15.68 times standard deviation divided by the minimal detectable effect squared. Okay, we're back to that model when rho is 0. On the other hand, when rho goes to 1, now all responses in the cluster are identical. But there's a big tax now. Right? This is a very large adjustment because the real sample size is reduced to the number of clusters. Of course, in practice, now this is a hard coefficient to obtain in many settings. In practice, it would be somewhere between 0 and 1, but closer to 0 than 1, of course. So in our particular experiment, doing some pilot testing, we find that rho equals 0.04. So it must be the case that I'm not going to have to penalize myself by much, right? Because the rho is so small. What do you think? The part of the equation that I'm leaving out, as Justin would say, I'm understating now, which you'll see why. Let's say they wish to detect a 1/10 standard deviation change, and we want to use a standard approach. So I know right away that under the old approach, a 1/10 standard deviation would suggest that I need 1,568 at each level. Okay, so in total I have 3136 divided by 4, and that's what each city gets. That's under the old approach. Under the new approach, we have to think about what the real sample size is. Now in this case, I can run it through that simple formula, and I see I have 784. Of course, that's this number divided by 4 times 4, and then the adjuster. I find that the real sample size in this case is 97. That's how big of a tax that a rho of 0.04. How could a rho of 0.04 have such a large tax? Because the number of clusters is only 4, right? That hurts. Now, if you run this all the way through, we think about what is the required sample size, put it in the necessary sample size equation, and what we end up with is, before, of course, we had that. Now we have 15.68 times 3232. We had 32 times the sample that we needed before, or over 50,000 at each incentive level. Yes?
You're taking a number of clusters and then figuring out how many people
Number of clusters is given.
Yeah, so why not try to figure out what is the right number of clusters?
Exactly. That's a different kind of problem, but if United tells me you can only have 4 cities, then I take it and I proceed like this. The other way is I can determine the optimal number of clusters and the number within that. And it's the same sort of equation. That's right. That's a richer problem, and one that you can easily do with these equations. What's the trade-off between the number of clusters and the number within each cluster on a given row? Right? And the cost per observation, too. Yeah. With all this, now you can do that.
Am I right that, I mean, you have the same problem, don't you? You randomize at the individual level, but then the individuals are naturally clustered within groups. For example, which is common in education settings or in schools with a class size, even if you randomize individuals.
Yeah, that there are peer effects. These are things that you can estimate. If the randomization occurs at the student level, then I can explore if I treated him but not his 3 friends versus if I treated him and his 3 friends, what are the differences in outcome variables? That seems to me like an empirical question after you set up the design, and your design might want to test for these peer effects, that there are spillovers, so to speak. That's right.
There's that, but then there's also that situation where there is an individual treatment, but then there's a situation where you can randomize the individual level by having group treatment. For example, in the Tennessee class size experiment, they randomly assigned kids to classes, but then they had some big classes and some small
Right.
classes.
But the treatment variable there is the number of kids in the classroom. And then they used, did they use the classroom as the observation, or did they use the kids in the classroom as the observation? It probably varies depending on study.
So suppose you were only given 2 cities, then find the formula, I guess you double.
Good.
But it seems like it would raise or highlight another issue. I mean, then it really emphasizes there may be some other unobservable thing that's happening in those cities.
Exactly, that's causing that 0.04, and then we can explore what that is. Yeah. Yes.
Can you sometimes face a choice between cluster level randomization and individual randomization, where it's not clear you have to do it at the cluster level, but maybe there's some advantage, but your data is taxed by doing it at the cluster level? And is there any sort of general way of thinking about it?
I think it is that way. What are the potential costs when you do it at the individual level? It's easier to do it at the city level, and there might be some contamination. This is what you were kind of talking about earlier, was a contamination. I don't think of it as contamination. I think of that as kind of a rich empirical question. But yeah, that's one of the trade-offs. If you had to make the decision in the end about cluster or individual, there might be a good reason why you want to do it at the village level. A lot of good reasons, instead of at the individual level. Yeah. But this tax will be one of the variables that helps you determine that. Yes?
In cases where the treatment is more expensive, are you basically trying to maximize power per dollar?
You know, it's the same thing. And I just wrote that. I'm glad you asked that, because I was thinking about that this morning when I was watching Mark Burley of the White Sox pitch a perfect game. And here's exactly what I wrote down. The ratio of sample sizes is inversely proportional to the square root of the relative cost. So it has the same sort of flavor as the variance does. Okay, so let me read that again. Ratio of sample sizes is inversely proportional to the square root of the relative cost. Now, that was something that I was doing this morning. You can check me on that, but I believe that's correct. I'm confident that that's correct. Ratio of sample sizes is inversely proportional to the square root of the relative cost. But that's a consideration that I haven't had in here yet. And in some sense, you might be thinking, wow, there are a lot of things now that are going on, because I have to consider cost, I have to consider what level to randomize, I have to consider row. Row's hard to detail, too. Michael, what are some rows in your world? A lot of times in education, I think about 0.05 or less, or 0.1. Are you getting higher rows than that?
You can get, so my experience is in education, you can get truly huge rows, because you get, if you're a unit of randomization at the school, there's just huge variations between the quality of the
Yeah, if it's school. But I was thinking classroom.
Oh,
Yeah, yeah.
within the school.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. That.
There's a lot of schools where there's just one class per grade.
Uh,
Often has much lower rows. multiple classrooms within a school, that can help.
Exactly. But then you get into this issue of one kid. That's what we have at Chicago Heights, which I'll talk about this afternoon, where we're randomizing at the individual level, and then one kid has it, and the kid next to her in class does not have it. It presents some good things and some bad things. You can see the good things, but of course you can think about the bad things too. You want to add something to this? Go ahead.
So if you have free data, that can help a lot as well. If your row is really fixed fast, you fall the baseline, you'll throw some of that active row.
Right. Exactly. Okay. Good. So let's end by talking a little bit about block design and factorial design and fractional factorial design. So what I have here is a depiction of a fractional factorial design wherein I'm thinking that there are 3 experimental variables. And if we want to talk about United or Walmart, we can think about price being 1. We can think about number of ads being 1, and we can think about rebates being a 3rd variable. And as I have on this figure, let's start over here and move this way, this way, or this way. I only have 2 levels of each particular variable. So each variable can either be low or high. And what one approach could be in this case is to run a full factorial experiment. What does that mean when I have 3 experimental variables that can either be low or high? How many cells would I need? I need 8, right? 2 to the 3rd. And all you need to do is count these. That's if you, I'm not sure why anyone would do this, but sometimes people do this. A lot of times people do a full factorial design, right? You want to get every interaction when two are turned on, one's turned off, et cetera, et cetera. What would be a more efficient type of design that also maintains balance? And I've given you a hint up here. Turn them all on, or turn one on at a time. That would be what would be considered a balanced, optimal, fractional factorial design. I'm not going to get into why that's the case. We can talk about it afterwards since we're running out of time. But in that case, you have, why? Because you have each of the individuals, and you also have all 3 turned on. You do miss something here, don't you? Right? You're making an assumption on some interactions, and you might be missing some important interactions. But nonetheless, you're running half, and you're doubling your sample size if you have a set budget or a set number of observations you can gather. Okay, so I'll leave this as a homework exercise, but let's compare this to block design. Okay, so in fractional factorial, literally think about, as a student walks in, I have a set number of observations that I want in each of these cells, and then I just give them to people randomly as they walk in, and then when these cells are filled up, they're filled up. That would be a factorial design. A block design, what I'm doing is I'm saying, I want men to have an equal number of men in treatment, equal number in control, so I'm blocking on men, and that guarantees that I have representation of men in both the treatment and the control. Why is that nice? Well, that's nice because then I can look at heterogeneous treatment effects, for example, afterwards, and I have some degree of power to detect whether my treatment is different across men and women. In a fractional design, that's not necessarily true. I might not have much representation in one of the important observables. So even if I do run a regression afterwards, I might not have a lot of power to detect heterogeneous treatment effects.
I'm sure I understand why this is more efficient than doing all 8. Are you increasing? So
I'm increasing these cells here. And then I'm making assumptions on the interaction terms.
But if you're going to make those assumptions on the interaction terms, couldn't you just, like, say you're looking at prices, you price it at 1, 2, or 0, and then you really need to know interaction terms. You can just add up the effects.
Remember, I have the 3 though. I have all of them turned on one by one, and then I have all 3 turned on.
So suppose you did price in the presence of the advertising also, which you don't have in this design. If you assume there's no interaction effect, could you just add that effect to the other 2 effects and look at the sum of the effects?
But then you have 2 variances there. You're getting a noisier estimate. Go ahead.
Your example here has 3 different treatments. In your example with words about stratifying on a covariate, say men versus women, and thinking about how the treatments different, is there anything salient in terms of whether you think about when you think of treatment versus covariate? In terms of the fractional, factorial design versus block design?
You know, in the experimental literature, people many times do take gender as having experimental variation, and then they look at that. You know, think of it as sex rather than gender. But it is true, though, that in one case you have experimental variation, in the other you don't. So that's how, in fact, you should interpret the results from them as well. I think that's the main difference. But when you block on an observable characteristic, remember, all you want is some kind of representation that will satisfy a necessary power test. But in that way, they're intertwined because remember, I still have to back off and say, how many treatment cells should I actually have? Right? In the optimal design, given a fixed budget, it gives you an idea if you want type 1 error of 0.05 and type 2 error of 0.2, that also dictates your number of cells that you can have in an important way. But it dictates it in a lot different way than the blocking when you have something endogenous coming in. Yeah. Any other questions on this? Yes.
What does this factorial design decision have to do with the blocking decision? I understand the 2, I think.
They're just 2 different ways to randomize. One, I'm going to take a stand on blocking, so I'm going to make sure that half men and half men get treatment, half men get control. This design does not ensure that. A factorial design does not, because the randomization is based on timing or whatever, or coin flipping. I can block within a factorial design. Yeah, I can certainly block within that. Exactly. Exactly. That's kind of where we're going. I agree. Yeah, I agree. Okay? So I have 3 minutes. I'm going to briefly introduce what I'm going to be talking about this afternoon, hopefully to get you back. I will start with one type of framed field experiment, which will be the Chicago Heights classroom performance experiments that we've run for the last year. And essentially what these are a few different incentive schemes to try to enhance the performance of students at Chicago Heights High School. Okay? B will be what I denote as an artifactual field experiment, and that will be hopefully complementary to what Michael talks about, in that we go to a developing country but run an experiment in a different way than the way Michael usually thinks about running experiments in developing countries. literally going into a village and having them play games. Lab games, essentially, is what this will be about. Okay, and C will be composed of natural field experiments, which a large part of it will be on the economics of charity. So these will be with nonprofit firms, and the idea will be trying to maximize the level of contributions to the charity or try to maximize the level of total contributions that people are making. And then we will also touch on experiments in various firms, United Airlines, Chrysler, Zappos Shoes, and a few other firms. I'll talk briefly about some experiments within those firms and what we've learned so far in running natural field experiments for them, and hopefully they've gotten something from us. In many cases, they've made a little bit of money. So that's where this afternoon we'll be going. I will be talking primarily about examples in the field experimental literature. So I wanted to use this morning for, let's think about what a field experiment is. Let's think about why they're useful. And let's think about, if I wanted to run a field experiment tomorrow, what are some of the design considerations? We've only scraped the design considerations. I mean, I'm thinking very hard recently about Bayesian sampling. I think that I see that as the future of experimentation within economics, because it's just so much more efficient. But I just don't know enough about it yet to talk with you in a reasonable manner. But I think that's where this area is going, and I think it's going there for, in some sense, a good reason. There will also be, classical will remain, but I see the future is moving into that area for optimal design.